Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Battle of Brunanburh, which is um, it's not a super long poem, but in the context of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the source for this poem, it is the longest of the few poems that are included. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is basically a history of the English people, a medieval history of the English people, is largely a prose document, but there are a few poems. The Battle of Brunanburh is one. So the Battle of Brunanburh occurred, the battle itself, occurred in 937, and so I'll let you know, I'm reading this out of the Broadview Anthology of English Literature, the Medieval Period volume. And so what the Broadview editors say as background for the battle itself is: the poem commemorates a military victory by King Aethelstan of Wessex, who ruled from 924 to 939, and his brother Edmund against a combined army of Norsemen, Scots, Irish, and Britons led by Anlaf, or Olaf, the Norse king of Dublin. The site of the battle is said to have taken place at Brunanburh, but the site cannot be identified today. It was a battle between the Anglo-Saxon English and a combined army, primarily of, we would tend to call them Vikings today, but Scandinavians, Danes, Norse, what have you, from their capital in Dublin, along with Scots and the Kingdom of Strathclyde, which is sort of a kingdom in southern Scotland, northern England, the Borders region. So they all sort of combined forces to attack the Anglo-Saxon English, and they were defeated at the Battle of Brunanburh. No one is quite sure where that battle took place. I think the dominant speculation is somewhere in northern England, but a site has not been positively identified. So, what's interesting about the poem is actually that it really reflects this tradition of Anglo-Saxon epic poetry, using the same kind of language, the same kind of linguistic technique, style that you see in other Anglo-Saxon epic poetry. The most famous example, of course, being Beowulf. So I'm going to take you through some portions of this poem. We'll talk about some of the interesting epic elements of it. So I want to start with the opening first 20 lines, which will give you a flavor of the writing style. Here Aethelstan, king, lord of warriors, bestower of rings, and his brother also, Edmund the prince, won eternal glory with the blade of their swords in battle around Brunanburh. They split the shield wall, hacked at shields with the hammer's leavings. Edward's sons, as suited their noble descent from royal ancestors, that they often at battle should defend their land against all enemies, their hoard and homes. Their attackers fell. Scottish men and seafarers fated to die. The field flowed with the blood of warriors. From when the sun rose shining in the morning, the glorious star glided over the earth, God's bright candle, the eternal Lord, until that noble creation sank to its seat. There many a man lay spattered by spears, men of the north shot over their shields, and Scotsmen as well, weary, dazed with war. So that's the general style of Anglo-Saxon epic poetry. It is very much a sort of rhythmic thing. It's very easy to read aloud, actually, in part because Anglo-Saxon epic poetry was traditionally an oral genre, right? It was traditionally spoken. By the time you get to the composition of this poem, this was likely a written poem, but it was written still in the vein of the earlier oral traditions. And so the sound of it is very important, and that it be easy to say aloud was very important. So let's talk about some of the... Well, so I want to jump to the end, because there's an interesting twist at the end here. And then I'll come back to some of the Anglo-Saxon linguistic elements that are really interesting and that make this stylistically a very distinctively Anglo-Saxon poem. So, toward the end, really starting at line 66 and going through about 69, there's this bit. There was never a greater slaughter on this island, nor ever yet so many people slain by the sword's edges before this, as books tell us, old wise men, since from the east, the Angles and Saxons came up across the broad sea to seek Britain. And then there's a little bit more after that. So actually, I read through about line 71, but it doesn't matter. The point is, this phrase, as books tell us, old wise men, it marks an interesting shift, right? Because it is this transition from oral literature, again, something like Beowulf, which was probably composed around the 8th century or so and not written down until the 10th, maybe? So there's a couple of centuries where that poem exists in an oral tradition and not a written form, as far as we know. Here we have a transition, right? So let me find the dates here. So Alfred the Great had ruled from 871 to 899. So it was about 40 years almost between when Alfred the Great dies and the Battle of Brunanburh. Now, the reason that's important is because Alfred the Great was a big patron of literature. He believed, he built up a royal library, right? He believed in the importance of writing things down. And so at this time, between Alfred's reign and subsequent kings, you're getting a transition to a literate monarchy. Maybe not a literate monarchy necessarily, in that the monarchs themselves may not have been able to read, but a monarchy that believes in the importance of having written records of things, including written histories. And so, whereas monastic people in monasteries, cloisters, things like this, people like the Venerable Bede, had long believed in the importance of sort of written histories, writing things down, keeping records. Under Alfred, there is a marked shift where the monarchy, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, starts to believe this is important. And so this shift, as books tell us, old wise men, there's this sort of recognition. There's this recognition of the transition from an oral culture that produces Beowulf to a literate culture, a writing-based culture, in which art, in which history, in which things like tax records, bureaucratic elements are all written down and recorded. And that's a big, big shift in terms of how information is kept and transmitted. So that's, I think, really interesting. So let's talk about the style here, because this is, again, very much an Anglo-Saxon poem. So one of the things the Anglo-Saxons loved was alliteration. This is really, really useful in oral poetry, because if you have that sound to cue you about what the next word is going to be, it's much easier to remember it and to speak long poems aloud when you have those verbal cues. So this is obviously translated into modern English. This is not Old English, which the Anglo-Saxons would have spoken, but the translator here, R.M. Liuzza, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, I'm sorry, Liuzza, has preserved at least some of that alliteration. By the way, alliteration, for those of you who don't know, that's when the same sound starts a series of words. So, for instance, shattered by spears, men of the north shot over their shields, and Scotsmen as well. We have a set of S's in those two lines. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words that start with S's in two lines. Let's see. homes and hordes, Scottish men and seafarers. Sun rose shining in the morning, that glorious star. S's. So this is a very much Anglo-Saxon thing. And again, it's a technique used very commonly in oral poetry because it helps you remember what's coming next. So that's great. Another thing that we have is phrases like swords whetstone sharp, which comes in the next portion of it. This is what's called a post-positive or post-nominal adjective. Basically, that means the adjective, the description of a noun, comes after the noun rather than before, right? Typically in English, in modern English, we would say whetstone sharp swords, if we were going to say that. Sharp swords, basically, rather than swords sharp. Take out whetstone. Linguistically, it's easier to sort of parse this, right? Sharp swords makes a lot more sense to a modern English ear than swords sharp. So this is what a post-positive or post-nominal adjective does. It reverses that typical order. That's a very common thing for the Anglo-Saxons. They love these. Another thing that they did all the time is what's called a kenning. A kenning is... it's sort of an incomplete metaphor, basically. It's a phrase in which, through particular associations, you get to the intended image. So out of the passage I originally read you, there's one very distinct one, which is the hammer's leavings. This is sword, or spearhead, because you used a hammer as a blacksmith to make a sword, or to make a spearhead or something like this. And that was what you would use. So it says here, they split the shield wall, hacked at shields with the hammer's leavings. They used their swords, they used their spears, possibly axes, to break through the defensive wall, the defensive shield wall constructed by their enemies. So this is a kenning, this is what it does. We have another one here a little bit later on. The Mercians did not refuse hard hand play. This is a kenning. It uses this phrasing to sort of, again, through this set of associations, because you use a hand to hold a sword, to hold a spear, to hold an axe, whatever it is. So we've got that element of this is battle, this is fighting, expressed in this poetic way. Another one, they use the phrase sword slaughter. And again, the sword is not actually doing the slaughter, and I recognize that that's a little bit like people don't kill people, guns don't kill people, people kill people bullshit. But the idea of the sword slaughter, it is not in itself that the sword is being blamed, it is that this is battle. This is a poetic, artistic representation of the concept of battle. Another one a little bit later on, the phrase dreary spear leavings, which refers to the dead or the wounded. Because what does a spear leave when you pull it out of someone's body? A wound. So the wounded, the dead, the injured on the field, the Norse who are fleeing the field have abandoned their dead and wounded. So this is a technique that the Anglo-Saxons really liked. It is a means of creating associations between different ideas that both utilizes poetic imagery, but also would force the listener or the reader to think carefully about the meanings of language. Another thing the Anglo-Saxons love, which I also love, is what's called leitmotifs. Leitmotifs is basically artistic understatement. So we got a few examples here. The phrase, 5 lay dead on the field of battle, 5 young kings put to sleep by swords. Put to sleep by swords. This is an ironic understatement for being killed. These were kings that were lost in battle. Put to sleep is, I mean, it's a euphemism, but it is an ironically understated euphemism, right? In this case, when we talk about like putting a pet to sleep or something like that, that's a euphemism out of kindness, but this is an ironic understatement. And we see this a bit more distinctly later on. There is the phrase, for instance, in that great. So this is about Constantinus, who was the king of the Scots, one of the enemies of the Anglo-Saxons in this battle. In that great meeting, he had no cause to rejoice. Yeah, this is just straight out understatement. This idea of this was a massive defeat in which his army was just crushed. Everything went wrong for Constantinus. That being presented as he had no cause to rejoice. It is very much Anglo-Saxon, very stylistically English, even through to today. A lot of English humor, a lot of English language among the English themselves, not English as a sort of whole language, but British English style tends still to be quite understated. Another example, a briefer one, when they took the field, they being the opposing side, the non-Anglo-Saxon side, when they took the field to play against the sons of Edward. Again, an ironic understatement because this was a life or death struggle. Very, very typically Anglo-Saxon. And again, all of these elements that I've been talking about are rooted in the tradition of oral poetry, oral epic poetry. We see all of these things in Beowulf as well. It's another great example of this. But we're seeing it here in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, within this poem, the Battle of Brunanburh, where it is preserved even into this sort of era of written texts.